Welcome back to History 1301. Today we are going to focus on Chapter 11 and the peculiar institution that was slavery in America. First things first, we are going to talk about Frederick Douglass. So you're going to hear me, discuss a little bit about his background, the fact that he was born into slavery but escaped to the North. He was also an abolitionist, and we'll be talking more about that later on. And he was also a preeminent advocate for racial equality. Okay, so first let's do a little bit of background on Frederick Douglass. Like I said, he was born into slavery in 1818, and he really kind of represented this quote-unquote self-made man in his rise to distinction, with humble origins, and his contributions to abolition and the meanings of that for Black freedom were super important. He was the son of a slave mother, and he had an unknown white father. He violated Maryland law by first learning how to read and write, but he also experienced slavery in all its varieties. So this includes, bondage as a house servant. He was also a skilled shipyard craftsman and a plantation field hand. So he really did have, like a wide variety of experiences when it comes to slavery. He was sent to a slave breaker to basically curb his spirit, right? Because he, was defiant and was just really adamant. He wasn't a good slave, let's put it that way. So they tried to break him, and he just refused to be broken, and that experience really kind of intensified his desire for freedom. And he used these borrowed papers from a Black sailor to escape from the plantation to the North. And he became one of the most influential African Americans, period. But also, he became a very famous advocate for racial equality during this 19th century. Okay, he lectured against slavery in the North. He lectured against slavery in Britain because eventually, he had to flee the United States as well. He edited anti-slavery publications. He published a wide variety of autobiographical condemnation of slavery, and testified to the incorrectness of the prevailing ideas of Black inferiority. So, these are all, parts of who Frederick Douglass was, parts of his experience, parts of his, drive, his motivation. He was really active, in other reform movements as well, not just abolitionism. But he was active in the movement for women's rights. He also advised President Lincoln, about Black soldiers' employment. And he was an early advocate for the right to vote, right? Not just for women, but for African Americans as well. Frederick Douglass died in 1865, just at the dawn of this new system of white supremacy that, began after the Civil War during Reconstruction. And so that system was based on segregation and disenfranchisement, which is essentially like preventing or stopping or intimidating people from voting. And so, throughout his career, he really insisted that continuous resistance could eliminate slavery, and that slaves' desire for freedom, okay, look at this, that slaves' desire for freedom was truer to the nation's principles than white Americans who annually celebrated independence while at the same time allowing slavery to continue. So that's a little introduction to who Frederick Douglass is. And we'll be talking more about that, in terms of, I want you to think about, his experience and how it would have been similar, or it is similar to the experience of other slaves, but then also consider how it was also different. Okay, so absolutely, one of the things about Frederick Douglass was the fact that that made him different, right, than regular slaves or your average slave, is that, he taught, he learned how to read and write, and he was determined, right? He was really kind of refused to be broken, refused to be quieted, and continued that fight. Okay, so think about those things as we move forward. Let's go ahead and look at the next slide. Okay, so here are the topics for the lecture today. We're going to be discussing, the Old South, life under slavery, slave culture, and resistance to slavery. All right, so first things first, this is our focus question or objective. How did slavery shape social and economic relations in the Old South? And so again, the purpose of this is really to highlight that we're going to be talking about so that, you are aware of what to focus on. And so we'll be bringing in, different types of historical evidence and events and examples to connect, the history to this theme. Okay, so as we go through each portion of the lecture, we're going to be bringing up these focus questions. So keep that in mind, right, as you follow along and are taking notes. So yeah, definitely write down this focus question, mark your notes, and, remember this when you are preparing for your next test, okay? All right, so let's talk about slavery and cotton. Okay, first of all, cotton is king, all right? Slavery became the peculiar institution for a reason, right? It's the peculiar institution of the South, okay? And all of this started happening after abolitionism began in the North, okay? The Old South was the largest and most powerful slave society of the modern world, so take that into consideration. And 3/4 of the world's cotton supply came from the South. But that's not all, because that same cotton also powered the textile mills of the North, right? Of the industrialized North and the industrialized revolution. So it's not like slavery was just like a Southern problem or a Southern issue. Both the North and the Southern economies were deeply entrenched and intertwined on the slavery issue, okay? The other thing we're going to talk about is the Second Middle Passage. And the Second Middle Passage was essentially how the slave trade was known, okay? It is extremely profitable. It is not something that, you can just get rid of overnight. And the other thing as well is that both economies, right, both in the North and the South benefited from it in one way or another. But the Southern ones in particular benefited from it the most. Especially the ones from states like Virginia, right, which really heavily relied on slave labor. Okay, so let's talk about what's going on with slavery around 1820. Like I said, slavery is an old institution in the United States. It goes all the way back to the beginning of English settlement. But with abolition, starting to gain more support and more ground in the North, this peculiar institution of slavery became quite unique to the South, okay? By the time we get to the Civil War, the slave population had increased to about 4 million slaves, okay? And slavery had spread to states like Arkansas, Louisiana, and eastern Texas. So it already gone on, quite west than just, the original colonies in the South, the original Southern colonies. And so if you think about it, slaves were 1/3 of the South's entire population and half of the population in the cotton states in the deep South. So, if you think about, we go all the way back to the Constitutional Convention and the 3/5 Compromise and all of that, the Electoral College, which on a night like today, all of these things are very relevant. Slaves made up a huge portion of the population, and the southern states wanted them to count for something. And so that issue in the whole, electoral college was put in there as a negotiation, right? To get the southern states to get on board and to support the new constitution. And then once the abolition of slavery happened after the Civil War, and all of those millions of slaves were no longer 3/5 of a population, but 5/5 of a population, there was no way that those southern states were going to make any kind of amendments to the Constitution that would get rid of the Electoral College, right? So this is something that, historians and political scientists and, all kinds of different people are looking at the history of it. So the point of it is that there is a very, very big slave population. And the problem here that's going on during this time is that as the nation is continuing to grow, so is the spread of slavery. So slavery's expansion was due to the profitability of cotton. And if you remember, cotton doesn't really explode until after the invention of the cotton gin, right? Which made it very easy to clean the cotton, whereas before it was very labor intensive, not really worth it, right? If you're in it to make money. But anyways, in the Old South, this is where they had the largest slave population and most powerful slave society in history, right? Now, this is based on the region's virtual monopoly on cotton, and cotton's use in the textile factory is really going to be central to the Industrial Revolution here in the United States, but then also in Europe. And it's going to be one of the most important commodities of this time period, when it comes to international trade. So cotton is huge. And cotton is responsible for the continuation of slavery, whereas, the cotton gin is responsible for that as well. And so, it's going to help the economy expand, not just in the United States, but abroad as well. And so think about this, right? Because we're talking about, this is in the early 1820s, right? By 1860, investments in slaves far exceeded the value of other industries, right? We're talking factories, railroads, banks, all of those things combined, okay? So how do you put a price on that, right? And how do you simply take somebody's property away? You see why this is a huge problem? Now, to replace the foreign slave trade that had been banned back by the United States in 1808, a massive internal slave trade in the United States developed, right? Now, more than 2 million slaves were sold between 1820 and 1860, many of whom were transported to the Deep South to other new cotton plantations. Okay, virtually every slave owner at some point bought and sold slaves. Now, this cotton kingdom could not have developed if not for this internal slave trade that took place here in the United States. All right, so let's talk about slavery and the Old South, okay? First of all, key points to address here, slavery and the nation. Northern merchants and manufacturers participated in the slave economy, and they shared in its profits, okay? It's not just the South. I want to keep hammering away with that. But profits also led to the North's industrial development and internal improvements and the growth of the cities and all of that, the generation of wealth, all of that stuff is happening thanks to slavery, thanks to cotton, thanks to, slave labor. Shipping, banking, textile manufacturing, all relied on large amounts of cotton and depended on those sales as well. Okay. Now in the Southern economy, we're going to divide it up between, the Upper South and then the Lower South, right? So in the Upper South, you have slave owners that made up a smaller percentage of the total population than in the Lower South. Now they were centers of industry, of the economy. It was definitely more diversified, okay? The other half of this argument as well is that slavery shaped the economy and the development of the South. This goes back all the way to, the original colonies. Remember, there was less industry, and that's going to continue as well. Less development, less immigrants, very little urban growth. So shorter railroads as well, and less infrastructure. Now again, why do that? Why not diversify? Why not grow the cities? Why not have more railroads? Because they didn't need it. Okay? Why? Because cotton is king. Okay, so it is a huge part of the South, but also the North. Let's not forget that. Although the northern states abolished slavery, slavery continued to affect them nonetheless. And the reason for that is because the Constitution enhanced the power of the South, not just in the House of Representatives, but also, like I was just saying, with the Electoral College. And there was also that law in there, right? The Fugitive Slave Law that basically required the states to return fugitives from bondage. Now, what this means is that slavery is going to touch the lives of all Americans, whether they are in the North or in the South, or they own slaves or they don't. And the reason for this is because northern merchants, for example, and manufacturers participated in the slave economy and they profited from it too. Cotton trade profits helped finance industrial development and internal improvements in the North. Northern ships carried cotton. Northern banks financed plantations. Northern companies insured slave property. And northern factories turned cotton into clothing. Now, what this means, you guys, is that slavery was, in fact, a very profitable institution, not just peculiar, but it was very, very profitable to both sides. And, it expanded the Southern economy as well as the Northern one. All right, so this is an interesting figure right here. Let's look at the growth of the slave population going back to 1790, right? We're looking at 697,000 slaves. By 1800, a couple hundred more. 1810, it's starting to balloon. And so by 1860, which is on the cusp, right, of the Civil War, right, the election of Abraham Lincoln, we're looking at nearly 4 million slaves right there. So you can see how the growth is, exponential, really kind of mitigates how and exemplifies how important the slave industry and the labor was to the American economy, like I said, on both sides, okay? All right, let's talk about class and the Old South. Key points that we're going to be addressing here is plain folk of the South and the planter class, okay? So let's talk about plain folks, right? Regular, average American Southerners. The majority of these white Southerners did not own slaves, okay? Most white small farmers lived in hilly areas that were unsuitable for cotton production. And so really they relied more on like family labor. The other thing as well is that most produced crops and livestock for their own families, and they resented the planters' power and their wealth. But they did believe that their economic and personal freedom rested on slavery. So even though they themselves might be regular poor white folks, they are nonetheless acceptance of slavery as an institution, because they see that that is kind of like where their prospects, their future, their freedom, their own freedom is guaranteed. Okay. When it comes to the planter class, right, there was a small number of slaveholders, right? That's the other thing too, is that not everybody was a slave owner. It's a very small amount of slaveholders, but these folks with like the large plantations and stuff like that, they dominated Southern life. What I mean by that is that these planters, they owned the majority of the slaves, and most of, the fertile lands, and they dominated, the politics in that region too. Okay, so why is this important? Well, okay, so why is this important? The thing here to recognize right away is that the majority of Southern white families do not own slaves, okay? The reason for this is because the planters, right, the Southern aristocrats, they are the ones that own the best land, and most small white farmers lived outside of those plantations, in areas that were really unsuitable for cotton. And so what that means is that they're going to work the land by themselves or with their families, or maybe, non-slaves or wage workers. Many of these folks are self-sufficient, kind of like the yeoman farmer, right, that Jefferson championed. And they often work, close to remote markets as well. They were often desperately poor, and more often than not, they were illiterate. Okay, so especially when you compare it to like northern farmers. And the reason for their illiteracy is that, remember, there just isn't a whole lot of educational institutions in the South. Not a lot of, free public education, not compared to the North, right? And so this sort of perpetuates that condition. Another thing as well to consider is that in part, because these farmers did not provide a market for manufactured goods, the South did very little to develop that industry. Like, they didn't need to, right? Remember, cotton is king. And so while some poor whites resented the planters, power and their, and their wealth, most accommodated the planters. And they shared with them this common racial identity, business ties, common political culture, kinship. The other thing as well is that most slave owners did not own these large plantations. In 1850, most slaveholding families owned about 5 or fewer slaves. Only a small number of families owned more than 20 slaves. And even fewer than that owned more than 100. So this idea that, all Southerners owned slaves, or all slave owners had, huge plantations with hundreds of slaves, is just really not a very accurate portrayal of slavery in the South, okay? So think about all of those things moving forward. Incredibly profitable, right, to both sides. Most Southerners, despite whether or not they were slave owners, they were okay with slavery, right? They were, because they believed that somehow they benefited from it, right? Whether or not it was economically, maybe it was more ideologically, in terms of like their freedom and things like that, okay? Okay, so let's talk about paternalism, because this is something that, you got to know what it means, and you got to know how it adds up to the equation here when it comes to the justification for slavery. So basically, this paternalistic ethos, what it is, planters' values glorified paternalism, right? Or this hierarchical agrarian society in which slaveholding gentlemen are basically taking personal responsibility for the care and the moral well-being of their dependents. So not only their women and children, but also their slaves, right? It's almost like this father figure that they're sort of claiming that, slaves are like a part of their family, much in the same way as their own children or their own relatives. And so they built this concept, they created this in order to mask and really to justify the brutality and the reality of what slavery truly was, by saying that, almost like arguing that slaves couldn't take care of themselves, that they needed these, white saviors to look out for them, to take care of them, because otherwise they wouldn't be able to take care of themselves or feed themselves and their families. So that's where this misplaced paternalism ethos comes from. The other thing as well has to do with, the pro-slavery argument. Now, this is a deep commitment to white supremacy, okay? There's no mistaking that at all. And for some, even the, legitimacy of slavery in biblical passages, claims by others that slavery was essential for human progress. And they also insisted that slavery guaranteed equality for whites. So let's break that down a little bit, okay? So in the 30 years before the Civil War, pro-slavery, this pro-slavery doctrine or thought or argument came to dominate Southern intellectual and cultural life. Now, why did this happen? Well, because fewer Southern whites felt, as had many founding fathers actually, that slavery was a necessary evil. Okay, more started to argue that it was a positive good. Racism, right? The belief that the blacks were innately inferior to the whites suited everybody in this case. And this is the reason why they justified slavery, why they justified racism, why they justified white supremacy. When it comes to, this argument that, blacks were inferior, some slave owners also felt that they found justification for slavery in the Bible. So there are several Bible passages where they mention slavery, where they mention almost like if it was God himself who was talking about it. And so other slave owners used history to justify it as well, claiming that George Washington, the greatest American to ever live, he had slaves, and Thomas Jefferson did, and so did all these other great, American figures. So why shouldn't we? What better example than them? And then yet still they could also look back at, even further in history and look at the Romans and look at the Greeks and look at the Egyptians, and it's like slavery, 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 right? So they use that as a justification or the argument to be pro-slavery. In any case, they're going to use that argument to say that slavery provided them with this economic autonomy, right? With the ability to have that independence and freedom and future prospects and wealth and all of that stuff because of it. And like I said, it's not just the South that benefits from it, it's the North too. So, think about this, because how does the planters, paternalism serve to justify the system of slavery, right? How did it hide it from the reality of the life of slaves? So these are all things that, I want you to think about as you're reading the chapter, as you're reading, watching the videos, the author videos and stuff like that. It's a lot of stuff, right? To consider. It's not simply black and white. There's a lot of different justifications that they're using. So if you come at them, it's like, well, you can't say that, or, that's not a good argument. They have, a list of other good arguments that they're willing to use.